Introduction. Samuel Burley Robotham, under the pseudonym Parallax, lectured for 2 decades. Up and down Britain promoting his unique flat earth theory. This book, in which he lays out his world system, went through 3 editions, starting with a 16-page pamphlet published in 1849 and a second edition of 221 pages published in 1865. The third edition of 1881, which had inflated to 430 pages, was used as the basis of this text. Robotham was an accomplished debater who reputedly steamrollered all opponents. And his followers, who included many well-educated people, were equally tenacious. One of them, John Hampden, got involved in a bet with the famous naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace about the flat earth. An experiment which Hampden proposed didn't resolve the issue, and the two ended up in court in 1876. The judge ruled against Hampden, who started a long campaign of legal harassment of Wallace. Robotham hints at the incident in this book. Robotham believed that the earth is flat. The continents float on an infinite ocean, which somehow has a layer of fire underneath it. The lands we know are surrounded by an infinite wilderness of ice and snow, beyond the Antarctic Ocean, bordered by an immense circular ice cliff. What we call the North Pole is in the center of the Earth. The polar projection of the flat Earth creates obvious discrepancies with known geography. Particularly the farther south you go. Figure 54 inadvertently illustrates this problem. The Zetetic map has a severely squashed South America and Africa, and Australia and New Zealand in the middle of the Pacific. I think that by the 19th century people would have noticed if Australia and Africa were thousands of miles further apart than expected, let alone if Africa was wider than it was long. The Zetetic sun, moon, planets and stars are all only a few hundred miles above the surface of the Earth. The sun orbits the North Pole once a day at a constant altitude. The moon is both self-illuminated and semi-transparent. Eclipses can be explained by some unknown object occulting the sun or moon. Zetetic cosmology is faith-based. That is, on a literal interpretation of selected biblical quotes. Hell is exactly as advertised, directly below us. Heaven is not a state of mind, it is a real place. Earth not a globe s. Be Robotham. Somewhere above us. He uses Assyrian biblical chronology to mock the concept that stars could be millions of light years away. He attacks the concept of a plurality of worlds because no other world than this one is mentioned in the Bible. Robotham never adequately explains his alternative astronomy. If the Copernican theory so adequately explains planetary motions, why discard it, and what would he use in its place? What is the sun orbiting around once a day and how does it work? Like a spotlight, not a point source? If the moon is self-luminous, what creates its phases? If gravity appears to work here on Earth, why doesn't it apply to the celestial objects just a few hundred miles up? To make his system work he had to throw out a great deal of science, including the scientific method itself, using instead what he calls his Zetetic method. As far as I can see this as simply a license to employ circular reasoning. For example, the Earth is flat, hence we can see distant lighthouses, hence the Earth is flat. Zetetic astronomy is a key work of flat Earth thought, just as Donnelly's Atlantis, the antediluvian world is still considered required reading on the subject of Atlantis. If you ever have to debate the flat Earth pro or con, this book is a complete agenda of each point that you'll have to argue. John Bruno Hare, June 16, 2005. 8. Preface to the second edition. To the various critics who reviewed unfavorably the first edition of this work, and to those also who wrote and published replies to it, my thanks are due and now respectfully tendered. They pointed out several matters which, on proper examination, were not, as evidence, entirely satisfactory, and as my object is to discover and hold to that only which is true beyond doubt, I have omitted them in the present edition. The true business of a critic is to compare what he reads with known and provable data, to treat impartially the evidence he observes, and point out logical deficiencies and inconsistencies with first principles, but never to obtrude his own opinions. He should, in fact, at all times take the place of Astronomy, the goddess of justice, and firmly hold the scales, in which the evidence is fairly weighed. I advise all my readers who have become Zetetic not to be content with anything less than this, and also not to look with disfavor upon the objections of their opponents. Should such objections be well or even plausibly founded, they will only tend to free us from error, and to purify and exalt our Zetetic philosophy. In a word, let us make friends, or, at least, friendly and useful instruments of our enemies, and, if we cannot convert them to the better cause, let us carefully examine their objections, fairly meet them if possible, and always make use of them as beacons for our future guidance. In all directions there is so much truth in our favor that we can well afford to be dainty in our selection, and magnanimous, charitable, and condescending towards those who simply believe, but cannot prove, that we are wrong. We need not seize upon every crude and ill-developed result which offers, or only seems to offer, the slightest chance of becoming evidence in our favor, as every theorist is obliged to do if he would have his theory clothed and fit to be seen. We can afford to patiently wait, carefully weigh, and well consider every point advanced, in the full assurance that simple truth, and not the mere opinions of men, is destined, sooner or later, to have ascendancy. In Veritate Victoria. Parallax. London, September 24, 1872. 1 Zetetic and Theoretic defined and compared. The term zetetic is derived from the Greek verb zeto, which means to search, or examine, to proceed only by inquiry, to take nothing for granted, but to trace phenomena to their immediate and demonstrable causes. It is here used in contradistinction from the word theoretic, the meaning of which is speculative, imaginary, not tangible, scheming, but not proving. None can doubt that by making special experiments, and collecting manifest and undeniable facts, arranging them in logical order, and observing what is naturally and fairly deducible therefrom, the result must be more consistent and satisfactory than the contrary method of framing a theory or system assuming the existence and operation of causes of which there is no direct and practical evidence, and which is only claimed to be admitted for the sake of argument, and for the purpose of giving an apparent and plausible, but not necessarily truthful explanation of phenomena. All theories are of this character. Supposing, instead of inquiring, imagining systems, instead of learning from observation and experience the true constitution of things, speculative men, by the force of genius, may invent systems that will perhaps be greatly admired for a time. These, however, are phantoms which the force of truth will sooner or later dispel, and while we are pleased with the deceit, true philosophy, with all the arts and improvements that depend upon it, suffers. The real state of things escapes our observation, or, if it presents itself to us, we are apt either to reject it wholly as fiction, or, by new efforts of the vain ingenuity, to interweave it with our own conceits, and labor to make it tally with our favorite schemes. Thus, by blending together parts so ill-suited, the whole comes forth in absurd composition of truth and error. 1. These have not done near so much harm as that pride and ambition which has led philosophers to think it beneath them to offer anything less to the world than a complete and finished system of nature, and, in order to obtain this at once, to take the liberty of inventing certain principles and hypotheses from which they pretend to explain all her mysteries. 1. Neither let anyone, so far as hypotheses are concerned, expect anything certain from astronomy, since that science can afford nothing of the kind, lest, in case he should adopt for truth things feigned for another purpose, he should leave this science more foolish than he came. Earth not a globe s. B. Robotham. Theories are things of uncertain mode. They depend, in a great measure, upon the humor and caprice of an age, which is sometimes in love with one, and sometimes with another. The system of Copernicus was admitted by its author to be merely an assumption, temporary and incapable of demonstration. The following are his words: "It is not necessary that hypotheses should be true, or even probable, it is sufficient that they lead to results of calculation which agree with calculation. The hypothesis of the terrestrial motion was nothing but an hypothesis, valuable only so far as it explained phenomena, and not considered with reference to absolute truth or falsehood. The Newtonian and all other views and systems have the same general character as the hypothesis of the terrestrial motion, framed by Copernicus. The foundations or premises are always unproved, no proof is ever attempted, the necessity for it is denied, it is considered sufficient that the assumptions seem to explain the phenomena selected. In this way it is that theory supplants theory, and system gives way to system, often in rapid succession, as one failure after another compels opinions to change. Until the practice of theorizing is universally relinquished, philosophy will continue to be looked upon by the bulk of mankind as a vain and mumbling pretension, antagonistic to the highest aspirations of humanity. Let there be adopted a true and practical free thought method, with sequence as the only test of truth and consistency. And the philosopher may become the priest of science and the real benefactor of his species. Honesty of thought is to look truth in the face, not in the side face, but in the full front, not merely to look at truth when found, but to seek it till found. There must be no tampering with conviction, no hedging or mental prevarication, no making the wish father to the thought, no fearing to arrive at a particular result. 2. Think honestly, then, is to think freely. Freedom and honesty of thought are truly but interchangeable terms. For how can he think honestly, who dreads his being landed in this or that conclusion? Such an one has already predetermined in his heart how he shall think, and what he shall believe. Perfect truth, like perfect love, casteth out fear. Let the method of simple inquiry, the Zetetic process, be exclusively adopted. Experiments tried and facts collected, not such only as corroborate an already existing state of mind, but of every kind and form bearing on the subject, before a conclusion is drawn or a conviction affirmed. Nature speaks to us in a peculiar language, in the language of phenomena. She answers at all times the questions which are put to her, and such questions are experiments. 12. Earth not a globe. Nature lies before us as a panorama, let us explore and find delight. She puts questions to us, and we may also question her. The answers may ofttimes be hard to spell, but no dreaded sphinx shall interfere when human wisdom falters. We have an excellent example of a Zetetic process in an arithmetical operation. More especially so in what is called the golden rule, or the rule of 3. If a hundredweight of any article costs a given sum, what will some other weight, less or more, be worth? The separate figures may be considered as the elements or facts in the inquiry, the placing and working of them as the logical arrangement of the evidence, and the quotient, or answer, as the fair and natural deduction, the unavoidable or necessitated verdict. Hence, in every arithmetical or Zetetic process, the conclusion arrived at is essentially a quotient, which, if the details are correctly worked, must of necessity be true, and beyond the reach or power of contradiction. We have another example of the Zetetic process in our courts of justice. A prisoner is placed at the bar, evidence for and against him is demanded. When advanced, it is carefully arranged and patiently considered. It is then presented to the jury for solemn reconsideration, and whatever verdict is given, it is advanced as the unavoidable conclusion necessitated by the whole of the evidence. In trials, for justice, society would not tolerate any other procedure. Assumption of guilt, and prohibition of all evidence to the contrary, is a practice not to be found among any of the civilized nations of the earth, scarcely indeed, among savages and barbarians, and yet assumption of premises, and selection of evidence to corroborate assumptions, is everywhere, and upon all subjects, the practice of theoretical philosophers. The Zetetic process is also the most natural method of investigation. Nature herself always teaches it, it is her own continual suggestion. Children invariably seek information by asking questions, by earnestly inquiring from those around them, fearlessly, anxiously, and without the slightest regard to consequences, question after question, in rapid and exciting succession, will often proceed from a child, until the most profound in learning and philosophy, will feel puzzled to reply, and often the searching cross-examinations of a mere natural tyro, can only be brought to an end by an order To retire to bed, to school, to play, to anywhere rather than that the fiery Zetetic ordeal shall be continued. If then both nature and justice, as well as the common sense and practical experience of mankind demand, and will not be content with less or other than the Zetetic process, why is it ignored and constantly violated by the learned in philosophy? What right have they to begin their disquisitions with fanciful data, and then to demand that, to these all surrounding phenomena be molded? As private individuals they have, of course, a right to do as they like with their own, but as authors and public. 13. Earth not a globe s. Berobeth them. Teachers their unnatural efforts are immeasurably pernicious. Like a poor animal tied to a stake in the center of a meadow, where it can only feed in a limited circle, the theoretical philosopher is tethered to his premises, enslaved by his own assumptions. And however great his talent, his influence, his opportunities, he can only rob his fellow men of their intellectual freedom and independence, and convert them into slaves like himself. In this respect astronomical science is especially faulty. It assumes the existence of certain data, it then applies these data to the explanation of certain phenomena. If the solution seems plausible, it is considered that the data may be looked upon as proof demonstrated by the apparently satisfactory explanation they have afforded. Facts, and explanations of a different character, are put aside as unworthy of regard, since that which is already assumed seems to explain matters, there need be no further concern. Guided by this principle, the Secretary of the Royal Astronomical Society, Professor de Morgan, of Trinity College, Cambridge, reviewing a paper by the author, in the Athenaeum, for March 25, 1865, says: "The evidence that the Earth is round is but cumulative and circumstantial. Scores of phenomena ask, separately and independently, what other explanation can be imagined except the sphericity of the Earth? It is thus candidly admitted that there is no direct and positive evidence that the Earth is round, that it is only imagined or assumed to be so in order to afford an explanation of scores of phenomena. This is precisely the language of Copernicus, of Newton, and of all astronomers who have labored to prove the rotundity of the Earth. It is pitiful in the extreme that after so many ages of almost unopposed indulgence, philosophers, instead of beginning to seek, before everything else, the true constitution of the physical world, are still to be seen laboring only to frame hypotheses, and to reconcile phenomena with imaginary and ever-shifting foundations. Their labor is simply to repeat and perpetuate the self-deception of their predecessors. Surely, the day is not far distant when the very complications which their numerous theories have created, will startle them into wakefulness, and convince them that for long ages past they have but been idly dreaming. Time wasted, energies thrown away, truth obscured, and falsehood rampant, constitute a charge so grave that coming generations will look upon them as the bitterest enemies of civilization, the heaviest drags on the wheels of progress, and the most offensive embodiment of frivolity, pride of learning, and canting formality. Worse than this, by their position, their standing in the front ranks of learning, they deceive the public. They appear to represent a solid phalanx of truth and wisdom, when in reality they are but as the flimsy ice of an hour's in duration, all surface, without substance, or depth, or reliability, or power to save from danger and ultimate destruction. Let the practice of theorizing be abandoned as one oppressive to the reasoning powers. 14. Earth not a globe. Fatal to the full development of truth, and, in every sense, inimical to the solid progress of sound philosophy. If, to ascertain the true figure and condition of the Earth, we adopt the Zetetic process, which truly is the only one sufficiently reliable, we shall find that instead of its being a globe one of an infinite number of worlds moving on axis and in an orbit round the Sun, it is the directly contrary a plane, without diurnal or progressive motion, and unaccompanied by anything in the firmament analogous to itself, or, in other words, that it is the only known material world. 15. 2 experiments demonstrating the true form of standing water, and proving the Earth to be a plane. If the Earth is a globe, and is 25,000 English statute miles in circumference, the Surface of all standing water must have a certain degree of convexity. Every part must be an arc of a circle. From the summit of any such arc there will exist a curvature or declination of 8 inches in the first statute mile. In the second mile the fall will be 32 inches, in the third mile, 72 inches, or 6 feet, as shown in the following diagram. Figure 1. Let the distance from T to figure 1 represent 1 mile, and the fall from 1 to A, 8 inches. Then the fall from 2 to B will be 32 inches, and from 3 to C, 72 inches. In every mile. After the first, the curvature downwards from the point T increases as the square of the distance multiplied by 8 inches. The rule, however, requires to be modified after the first 1,000 miles. 1. The following table will show at a glance the amount of curvature, in round numbers, in different distances up to 100 miles. 2. 1. Any work on geometry or geodesy will furnish proofs of this declination. 2. To find the curvature in any number of miles not given in the table, simply square the number. Multiply that by 8, and divide by 12. The quotient is the curvation required. Earth not a globe. S. B. Robotham. Curvature. In statute mile fall. 1 8 inches. 2 32. 3 6 feet. 4 10. 5 16. 6 24. 7 32. 8 42. 9 54. 10 66. 2266. 3600. 41,066. 51,666. 62,400. 73,266. 84,266. 95,400. 100. 6666. 120. 9600. It will be seen by this table that after the first few miles the curvature would be so great that no difficulty could exist in detecting either its actual existence or its proportion. Experiments made on the seashore have been objected to on account of the constantly changing altitude of the surface of the water, and of the existence of banks and channels which produce a crowding of the waters, as well as currents and other irregularities. Standing water has therefore been selected, and many important experiments have been made, the most simple of which are the following. In the county of Cambridge there is an artificial river or canal, called the Old Bedford. It is upwards of 20 miles in length, and, except at the part referred to at page 16, passes in a straight line through that part of the fens called the Bedford. Level. The water is nearly stationary, often completely so, and throughout its entire length has no interruption from locks or water gates of any kind, so that it is, in every respect, well adapted for ascertaining whether any or what amount of convexity really exists. 18. Earth not a globe. Experiment 1. A boat, with a flagstaff, the top of the flag 5 feet above the surface of the water, was directed to sail from a place called Welch's Dam, a well-known ferry passage, to another called Welney Bridge. These 2 points are 6 statute miles apart. The author, with a good telescope, went into the water, and with the eye about 8 inches above the surface, observed the receding boat during the whole period required to sail to Welney Bridge. The flag and the boat were distinctly visible throughout the whole distance. There could be no mistake as to the distance passed over, as the man in charge of the boat had instructions to lift one of his oars to the top of the arch the moment he reached the bridge. The experiment commenced about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of a summer's day, and the sun was shining brightly and nearly behind or against the boat during the whole of its passage. Every necessary condition had been fulfilled, and the result was to the last degree definite and satisfactory. The conclusion was unavoidable that the surface of the water for a length of 6 miles did not to any appreciable extent decline or curvate downwards from the line of sight. But if the earth is a globe, the surface of the 6 miles length of water would have been 6 feet higher in the center than at the 2 extremities, as shown in diagram figure 2, but as the telescope was only 8 inches above the water, the highest point of the surface would have been at 1 mile from the place of observation, and below this point the Surface of the water at the end of the remaining 5 miles would have been 16 feet. Figure 2. Let AB represent the arc of water 6 miles long, and AC the line of sight. The point of contact with the arc would be at T, a distance of 1 mile from the observer at A. From T to the bridge at B would be 5 miles, and the curvature from T to B would be 16 feet 8 inches. The top of the flag on the boat, which was 5 feet high, would have been 11 feet 8 inches below the horizon T, and altogether out of sight. Such a condition was not observed, but the following diagram, Figure 3, exhibits the true state of the case A, B, the line of sight, equidistant from or parallel with the surface of the 19. Earth not a globe S. B robeth M. Water throughout the whole distance of 6 milts, from which it is concluded that the surface of standing water is not convex, but horizontal. Figure 3. Experiment 2. Along the edge of the water, in the same canal, 6 flags were placed, one statute mile from each other, and so arranged that the top of each flag was 5 feet above the surface. Close to the last flag in the series a longer staff was fixed, bearing a flag 3 feet square, and the top of which was 8 feet above the surface of the water, the bottom being in a line with the tops of the other and intervening flags, as shown in the following diagram, Fig. 4. Figure 4. On looking with a good telescope over and along the flags, from A to B, the line of sight fell on the lower part of the larger flag at B. The altitude of the point B above the water at D was 5 feet, and the altitude of the telescope at A above the water at C was 5 feet, and each intervening flag had the same altitude. Hence the surface of the water C, D, was equidistant from the line of sight A, B, and as AB was a right line, C, D, being parallel, was also a right line, or, in other words, the surface of the water, C, D, was for 6 miles absolutely horizontal. If the Earth is a globe, the series of flags in the last experiment would have had the form and produce the results represented in the diagram, Figure 5. 20. Earth not a globe. Figure 5. The water curvating from C to D, each flag would have been a given amount below the line A, B. The first and second flags would have determined the direction of the line of sight from A to B, and the third flag would have been 8 inches below the second, the fourth flag, 32 inches, the fifth, 6 feet, the sixth, 10 feet 8 inches, and the seventh, 16 feet 8 inches, but the top of the last and largest flag, being 3 feet higher than the smaller ones, would have been 13 feet 8 inches below the line of sight at the point B. The rotundity of the Earth would necessitate the above conditions, but as they cannot be found to exist, the doctrine must be pronounced as only a simple theory, having no foundation in fact, a pure invention of misdirected genius, splendid in its comprehensiveness and bearing upon natural phenomena, but, nevertheless, mathematical and logical necessities compel its denunciation as an absolute falsehood. The above-named experiments were first made by the author in the summer of 1838. But in the previous winter season, when the water in the old Bedford Canal was frozen, he had often, when lying on the ice, with a good telescope observed persons skating and sliding at known distances of from 4 to 8 miles. He lived for 9 successive months within 100 yards of the canal, in a temporary wooden building, and had many opportunities of making and repeating observations and experiments, which it would only be tedious to enumerate, as they all involved the same principle, and led to the same conclusions as those already described. It may, however, interest the reader to relate an instance which occurred unexpectedly, and which created such a degree of confusion, that he was repeatedly tempted to destroy the many memoranda he had previously made. Up to this time all his observations had been made in the direction of Welney, the bridge there affording a substantial signal point. But on one occasion, a gentleman who resided within a few miles of the temporary residence already alluded to, and with whom conversations and discussions had been repeatedly held, insisted upon the telescope being directed upon a barge sailing in an opposite direction to that previously selected. Watching the slowly receding vessel for a considerable time, it suddenly disappeared altogether. The gentleman co-observer cried out in a tone of exultation, "Now, sir, are you satisfied that the water declines?" 21. Earth not a globe s. B. Robotham. It was almost impossible to say anything in reply. All that could be done was to gaze in mute astonishment in the direction of the lost vessel, compelled to listen to the jeers and taunts of the apparent victor. After thus wonderingly gazing for a considerable time, with still greater astonishment the vessel was seen to suddenly come again into view. Obliged to admit the reappearance of the vessel, neither of us could fairly claim the victory, as both were puzzled and equally in an experimental fix. This condition of the question at issue lasted for several days, when, one evening conversing with a gunner, a shooter of wild fowl, upon the strange appearance referred to, he laughingly undertook to explain the whole affair. He said that at several miles away, beyond the ferry house, the canal made a sudden bend in the shape of the letter V when lying horizontally, and that the vessel disappeared on account of its entering into one side of the triangle, and reappeared after passing down the other side and entering the usual line of the canal. After a time a large map of the canal was found in a neighboring town, was Beach, and the gunner's statement fully verified. The following diagram will explain this strange, and for a time confounding, phenomenon. Figure 6. A represents the position of the observer, and the arrows the direction of the vessel, which, on arriving at the point B, suddenly entered the reach B, C, and disappeared. But which, on arriving at C, became again visible, and remained so after entering and sailing along the canal from C to D. The ferry house and several trees, which stood on the side of the canal, between the observer and the bend, had prevented the vessel being seen during the time it was passing from B to C. Thus the mystery was cleared away. The author was the real victor, and the gentleman referred to, with many others of the neighborhood, subsequently avowed their conviction that the water in the Bedford level at least, was horizontal, and they therefore could not see how the earth could possibly be a globe. Experiment 3. A good theodolite was placed on the northern bank of the canal, midway between Welney Bridge and the Old Bedford Bridge, which are fully 6 miles apart, as shown. 22. Earth not a globe. In diagram, Figure 7. Figure 7. The line of sight from the leveled theodolite fell upon the points B, at an altitude, making allowance for refraction, equal to that of the observer at T. Now the points B, being 3 miles from T, would have been the square of 3, or 9 times 8 inches, or 6 feet below the line of sight, C, as seen in the following diagram, Figure 8. Figure 8. Experiment 4. On several occasions the 6 miles of water in the Old Bedford Canal have been surveyed by the so-called forward process of leveling, which consisted in simply taking a sight of, say 20 chains, or 440 yards, noting the point observed, moving the instrument forward to that point, and taking a second observation, again moving the instrument forward, again observing 20 chains in advance, and so on throughout the whole distance. By this process, without making allowance for convexity, the surface of the water was found to be perfectly horizontal. But when the result was made known to several surveyors, it was contended that when a theodolite is leveled, it is placed at right angles to the Earth's radius, the line of sight from it being a tangent, and that when it is removed 20 chains forward, and again leveled, it becomes 23. Earth not a globe s. B. Robotham. A second and different tangent, and that indeed every new position is really a fresh tangent, as shown in the diagram, Figure 9. Figure 9. T1, T2, and T3, representing the theodolite leveled at 3 different positions, and therefore square to the radii 1, 2, 3. Hence, leveling forward in this way, although making no allowance for rotundity, the rotundity or allowance for it is involved in the process. This is a very ingenious and plausible argument, by which the visible contradiction between the theory of rotundity and the results of practical leveling is explained, and many excellent mathematicians and geodesists have been deceived by it. Logically, however, it will be seen that it is not a proof of rotundity, it is only an explanation or reconciliation of results with the supposition of rotundity, but does not prove it to exist. The following modification was therefore adopted by the author, in order that convexity, if it existed, might be demonstrated. Figure 10. A theodolite was placed at the point A, in Figure 10, and leveled. It was then directed over the flagstaff B to the cross staff C. The instrument A, the flagstaff B, and the cross staff C, having exactly the same altitude. The theodolite was then advanced to B, the flagstaff to C, and the cross staff to D, which was thus secured as a continuation of one and the same line of sight A, B, C, prolonged to D, the altitude of D being the same as that of A, B, and C. The theodolite was again moved forward to the 24. Earth, not a globe. Position C, the flagstaff to D, and the cross staff to the point E, the line of sight to, which was thus again secured as a prolongation of A, B, C, D, to E. The process was repeated to F, and onwards by 20 chain lengths to the end of 6 miles of the canal, and parallel with it, by thus having an object between the theodolite and the crossstaff, which object in its turn becomes the test or guide by which the same line of sight is continued throughout the whole length surveyed. The argument or explanation, which is dependent upon the supposition of rotundity, and that each position of the theodolite is a different tangent, is completely destroyed. The result of this peculiar or modified survey, which has been several times repeated, was that the line of sight and the surface of the water ran parallel to each other, and as the line of sight was, in this instance, a right line, the surface of the water for 6 miles was demonstrably horizontal. This mode of forward leveling is so very exact and satisfactory, that the following further illustration may be given with advantage. Figure 11. In Figure 11, let A, B, C, represent the first position, respectively of the theodolite, flagstaff, and cross staff, B, C, D, the second position, C, D, E, the third position, and D, E, F, the fourth, similarly repeated throughout the whole distance surveyed. The remarks thus made in reference to simple forward leveling, apply with equal force to what is called by surveyors the back and foresight process, which consists in reading backwards a distance equal to the distance read forwards. This plan is adopted to obviate the necessity for calculating, or allowing for the Earth's supposed convexity. It applies, however, just the same in practice, whether the base or datum. 25. Earth, not a globe. S. B. Robotham. Line is horizontal or convex, but as it has been proved to be the former, it is evident that back and foresight leveling is a waste of time and skill, and altogether unnecessary. Forward leveling over intervening test or guide staves, as explained by the diagram, Figure 11, is far superior to any of the ordinary methods, and has the great advantage of being purely practical and not involving any theoretical considerations. Its adoption along the banks of any canal, or lake, or standing water of any kind, or even along the shore of any open sea, will demonstrate to the fullest satisfaction of any practical surveyor that the surface of all water is horizontal. Experiment 5. Although the experiments already described, and many similar ones, have been tried and often repeated, first in 1838, afterwards in 1844, in 1849, in 1856, and in 1862. The author was induced in 1870 to visit the scene of his former labors, and to make some other, one or more, experiment of so simple a character that no error of complicated instrument or process of surveying could possibly be involved. He left London for Downham Market Station, on Tuesday morning, April 5, 1870, and arrived at the Old Bedford Sluice Bridge, about 2 miles from the station, at 12 o'clock. The atmosphere was remarkably clear, and the sun was shining brightly on and against the western face of the bridge. On the right-hand side of the arch a large notice board was affixed, a table of tolls, and C, for navigating the canal. The lowest edge of this board was 6 feet 6 inches above the water, as shown at B, Figure 12. Figure 12. A train of several empty turf boats had just entered the canal from the River Rouse, and was about proceeding to Romsey, in Huntingdonshire. An arrangement was made with the captain to place the shallowest boat, the last in the train, on the lowest part of the stern of this boat. A good telescope was fixed, the elevation being exactly 18 inches above the water. The sun was shining strongly against the white notice board. The air was exceedingly still and clear, and the surface of the water smooth as a molten mirror, so that everything was extremely favorable for observation. At 26. Earth not a globe. 1:15 p.m., the train of boats started for Welney. As the boats receded, the notice board was kept in view, and was plainly visible to the naked eye for several miles. But through the telescope it was distinctly seen throughout the whole distance of 6 miles. But on reaching Welney Bridge, a very shallow boat was procured, and so fixed that the telescope was brought to within 8 inches of the surface of the water, and still the bottom of the notice board was clearly visible. The elevation of the telescope being 8 inches, the line of sight would touch the horizon, if convexity exists, at the distance of 1 statute mile. The square of the remaining 5 miles, multiplied by 8 inches, gives a curvature of 16 feet 8 inches, so that the bottom of the notice board 6 feet 6 inches above the water should have been 10 feet 2 inches below the horizon. As shown in Figure 13b, the notice board, H, the horizon, and T, the telescope. Figure 13. Experiment 6. The following important experiment has recently been tried at Brighton, in Sussex. On the new or western pier a good theodolite was fixed, at an elevation of 30 feet above the water, and directed to a given point on the pier at Worthing, a distance of at least 10 statute miles. Several small yachts and other vessels were sailing about between the two piers, one of which was brought to within a few yards of the Brighton pier, and directed to sail as nearly as possible in a straight line towards the pier at Worthing, when the top of the mast, which scarcely reached the theodolite, was observed to continue below the line of sight throughout the whole distance, as shown in Figure 14a, representing the theodolite, and b, the pier at Worthing, from which it is concluded that the surface of the water is horizontal throughout the whole length of 10 miles. 27. Earth not a globe s. B. Robotham. Figure 14. Whereas, if the Earth is a globe, the water between the two piers would be an arc of a circle, as shown in Figure 15. Figure 15. The center of which would be 16 feet 8 inches higher than the two extremities, and the vessel starting from A, would ascend an inclined plane, rising over 16 feet, to the summit of the arc at C, where the masthead would stand considerably above the line of sight. From this point the vessel would gradually descend to the point B, at Worthing. As no such behavior of the vessel was observed, the 10 miles of water between the two piers must be horizontal. Experiment 7. The sea horizon, to whatever distance it extends to the right and left of an observer on land, always appears as a perfectly straight line, as represented by H, in Figure 16. Figure 16. 28. Earth not a globe. Not only does it appear to be straight as far as it extends, but it may be proved to be so by the following simple experiment. At any altitude above the sea level, fix a long board, say from 6 to 12 or more feet in length, edgewise upon tripods, as shown in Figure 17. Figure 17. Let the upper edge be smooth, and perfectly leveled. On placing the eye behind and about the center of the board B, and looking over it towards the sea, the distant horizon will be observed to run perfectly parallel with its upper edge. If the eye be now directed in an angular direction to the left and to the right, there will be no difficulty in observing a length of 10 to 20 miles, according to the altitude of the position, and this whole distance of 20 miles of sea horizon will be seen as a perfectly straight line. This would be impossible if the Earth were a globe, and the water of the sea convex. 10 miles on each side would give a curvature of 66 feet. 102. x8 equals 66 feet 8 inches, and instead of the horizon touching the board along its whole length, it would be seen to gradually decline from the center C, and to be over 66 feet below the two extremities B, as shown in Figure 18. Figure 18. Any vessel approaching from the left would be seen to ascend the inclined plane H, B, C, and on passing the center would descend from C towards the curvating horizon. At H such a phenomenon is never observed, and it may be fairly concluded that such convexity or curvature does not exist. 29. Earth not a globe S. B. Robotham. Experiment 8. A very striking illustration of the true form of the sea horizon may be observed from the high land in the neighborhood of the head of Portsmouth Harbor. Looking across Spithead to the Isle of Wight, the base or margin of the island, where water and land come together, appears to be a straight line from east to west, a length of 22 statute miles. If a good theodolite is directed upon it, the crosshair will show that the land and water line is perfectly horizontal, as shown in Figure 19. Figure 19. Figure 20. If the Earth is globular, the two ends east and west of the Isle of Wight would be 80 feet below the center, and would appear in the field of view of the theodolite, as represented in Figure 20. As a proof that such would be the appearance, the same instruments erected upon any object having an upper outline curved in the smallest degree, will detect and plainly show the curvature in relation to the crosshair B, or the leveled board employed in Experiment 7, Figure 18, will prove the same condition to exist, viz., that the margin of the Isle of Wight is, for 22 miles, a perfectly straight line, and instead of curvating downwards 80 feet each way from the center, as it certainly would if convexity existed, it is absolutely horizontal. From the lighthouse on Bitstone Hill, near Liverpool, the whole length of the Isle of Man, on a clear day and with a good telescope, is distinctly visible, and presents the same horizontal baseline as that observed in the Isle of Wight. From the high land near Douglas Harbour, Isle of Man, the whole length of the coast of North Wales is often plainly visible to the naked eye, a distance extending from 30. Earth not a globe. The point of air, at the mouth of the River Dee, towards Holyhead, not less than 50 miles. Whatever test has been employed, the line, where the sea and the land appear to join, is always found to be perfectly horizontal, as shown in the following diagram. Figure 21. Figure 21. Whereas, if the Earth is spherical, and therefore the surface of all water convex, such an appearance could not exist. It would of necessity appear as shown in Figure 22. Figure 22. A line stretched horizontally before the observer would not only show the various elevations of the land, but would also show the declination of the horizon H, below the cross line S, the 50 miles length of the Welsh coast seen along the horizon. In Liverpool Bay, would have a declination from the center of at least 416 feet, 252. X.8 inches equals 416 feet 8 inches. But as such declination, or downward curvation, cannot be detected, the conclusion is logically inevitable that it has no existence. Let the reader seriously ask whether any and what reason exists in nature to prevent the fall of more than 400 feet being visible to the eye, or incapable of detection by any optical or mathematical means whatever. This question is especially important when it is considered that at the same distance, and on the upper outline of the same land, changes of level of only a few yards extent are quickly and unmistakably perceptible. If he is guided by evidence and reason, and influenced by a love of truth and consistency, he cannot longer maintain that the Earth is a globe. He must feel that to do so is to war with the evidence of his senses, to deny that any importance attaches to fact and experiment, to ignore entirely the value of logical process, and to cease to rely upon practical induction. 31. Earth not a globe S. B. Robotham. Experiment 9. The distance across St. George's Channel, between Holyhead and Kingstown Harbour, near Dublin, is at least 60 statute miles. It is not an uncommon thing for passengers to notice, when in, and for a considerable distance beyond the centre of the channel, the light on Holyhead Pier, and the Poolbeck light in Dublin Bay, as shown in Figure 23. Figure 23. The lighthouse on Holyhead Pier shows a red light at an elevation of 44 feet above high water, and the Poolbeg Lighthouse exhibits two bright lights at an altitude of 68 feet, so that a vessel in the middle of the channel would be 30 miles from each light. And allowing the observer to be on deck, and 24 feet above the water, the horizon on a globe would be 6 miles away. Deducting 6 miles from 30, the distance from the horizon to Holyhead, on the one hand, and to Dublin Bay on the other, would be 24 miles. The square of 24, multiplied by 8 inches, shows a declination of 384 feet. The altitude of the lights in Poolbeg Lighthouse is 68 feet, and of the red light on Holyhead Pier, 44 feet. Hence, if the Earth were a globe, the former would always be 316 feet and the latter 340 feet below the horizon, as seen in the following diagram. Figure 24. Figure 24. The line of sight H, S, would be a tangent touching the horizon at H, and passing more than 300 feet over the top of each lighthouse. Many instances could be given of lights being visible at sea for distances which would 32. Earth not a globe. Be utterly impossible upon a globular surface of 25,000 miles in circumference. The following are examples. The coal fire, which was once used, on the Spurn Point Lighthouse, at the mouth of the Humber, which was constructed on a good principle for burning, has been seen 30 miles off. 3. Allowing 16 feet for the altitude of the observer, which is more than is considered necessary for 10 feet being the standard, but 6 feet may be added for the height of the eye above the deck. 5 miles must be taken from the 30 miles, as the distance of the horizon. The square of 5 miles, multiplied by 8 inches, gives 416 feet. Deducting the altitude of the light, 93 feet, we have 323 feet as the amount this light should be below the horizon. The above calculation is made on the supposition that statute miles are intended, but it is very probable that nautical measure is understood, and if so, the light would be depressed fully 600 feet. The Eger light, on West Point of Island, south coast of Norway, is fitted up with the first order of the dioptric lights, is visible 28 statute miles, and the altitude above high water is 154 feet. On making the proper calculation, it will be found that this light ought to be sunk below the horizon 230 feet. The Dunkirk light, on the south coast of France, is 194 feet high, and is visible 28 statute miles. The ordinary calculation shows that it ought to be 190 feet below the horizon. The Cordon light, on the River Gironde, west coast of France, is visible 31 statute miles, and its altitude is 207 feet, which would give its depression below the horizon as nearly 280 feet. The light at Madras, on the Esplanade, is 132 feet high, and is visible 28 statute miles, at which distance it ought to be beneath the horizon more than 250 feet. The Port Nicholson light, in New Zealand, erected in 1859, is visible 35 statute miles, the altitude being 420 feet above high water. If the water is convex, it ought to be 220 feet below the horizon. The light on Cape Bonavista, Newfoundland, is 150 feet above high water, and is visible 35 statute miles. These figures will give, on calculating for 3 lighthouses of the world. Laurie, 53, Fleet Street, London, 1862. Page 9. 4. By all the figures given is meant the minimum distance to which the light can be seen in clear weather from a height of 10 feet above the sea level. Ibid, p. 32. 33. Earth not a globe s. B. Robotham. The Earth's rotundity, 491 feet as the distance it should be sunk below the sea horizon. The above are but a few cases selected from the work referred to in the note on page 29. Many others could be given equally important, as showing the discrepancies between the theory of the Earth's rotundity and the practical experience of nautical men. The only modification which can be made in the above calculations is the allowance for refraction, which is generally considered by surveyors to amount to 1/12 the altitude of the object observed. If we make this allowance, it will reduce the various quotients so little that the whole will be substantially the same. Take the last case as an instance. The altitude of the light on Cape Bonavista, Newfoundland, is 150 feet, which, divided by 12, gives 13 feet as the amount to be deducted from 491 feet, making instead 478 feet, as the degree of declination. Many have urged that refraction would account for much of the elevation of objects seen at the distance of several miles. Indeed, attempts have been made to show that the large flag at the end of 6 miles of the Bedford Canal, Experiment 1, Figure 2, has been brought into the line of sight entirely by refraction. That the line of sight was not a right line, but curved over the convex surface of the water, and the well-known appearance of an object in the basin of water, has been referred to in illustration. A very little reflection, however, will show that the cases are not parallel. For instance, if the object, a shilling or other coin, is placed in a basin without water, there is no refraction. Being surrounded with atmospheric air only, and the observer being in the same medium, there is no bending or refraction of the eye line. Nor would there be any refraction if the object and the observer were both surrounded with water. Refraction can only exist when the medium surrounding the observer is different to that in which the object is placed. As long as the shilling in the basin is surrounded with air, and the observer is in the same air, there is no refraction, but whilst the observer remains in the air, and the shilling is placed in water, refraction exists. This illustration does not apply to the experiments made on the Bedford Canal, because the flag and the boats were in the same medium as the observer, both were in the air. To make the cases parallel, the flag or the boat should have been in the water, and the observer in the air. As it was not so, the illustration fails. There is no doubt, however, that it is possible for the atmosphere to have different temperature and density at two stations 6 miles apart, and some degree of refraction would thence result, but on several occasions the following steps were taken to ascertain whether any such differences existed. 2 barometers, 2 thermometers, and 2 hygrometers were obtained, each tube being of the same make, and reading exactly alike. On a given day, at 12 o'clock, all the instruments were carefully examined, and both of each 34 Earth, not a globe kind, were found to stand at the same point or figure. The 2 barometers showed the same density, the 2 thermometers the same temperature, and the 2 hygrometers the same degree of moisture in the air. One of each kind was then taken to the opposite station, and at 3 o'clock each instrument was carefully examined, and the readings recorded, and the observation to the flag, and sea, then immediately taken. In a short time afterwards the 2 sets of observers met each other about midway on the northern bank of the canal, when the notes were compared, and found to be precisely alike. The temperature, density, and moisture of the air did not differ at the 2 stations at the time the experiment with the telescope and flagstaff was made. Hence it was concluded that refraction had not played any part in the observation, and could not be allowed for, nor permitted to influence, in any way whatever, the general result. In 1851, the author delivered a course of lectures in the Mechanics Institute, and afterwards at the Rotunda, in Dublin, when great interest was manifested by large audiences, and he was challenged to a repetition of some of his experiments to be carried out in the neighborhood. Among others, the following was made, across the Bay of Dublin. On the pier, at Kingstown Harbour, a good theodolite was fixed, at a given altitude, and directed to a flag which, earlier in the day, had been fixed at the base of the Hill of Howth, on the northern side of the bay. An observation was made at a given hour, and arrangements had been made for thermometers, barometers, and hygrometers, 2 of each which had been previously compared, to be read simultaneously, one at each station, on the persons in charge of the instruments. Afterwards, meeting, and comparing notes, it was found that the temperature, pressure, and moisture of the air had been alike at the 2 points, at the time the observation was made from Kingstown Pier. It had also been found by the observers that the point observed on the Hill of Howth had precisely the same altitude as that of the theodolite on the pier, and that, Therefore, there was no curvature or convexity in the water across Dublin Bay. It was, of course, inadmissible that the similarity of altitude at the two places was the result of refraction, because there was no difference in the condition of the atmosphere at the moment of observation. The following remarks from the Encyclopaedia Britannica article, Leveling Bear on the question. We suppose the visual ray to be a straight line, whereas on account of the unequal densities of the air at different distances from the Earth, the rays of light are incurvated by refraction. The effect of this is to lessen the difference between the true and apparent levels, but in such an extremely variable and uncertain manner that if any constant or fixed allowance is made for it in formula or tables, it will often lead to a greater error. 35. Earth not a globe s. B. Robitham. Than what it was intended to obviate. For though the refraction may at a mean compensate for about 1/7 of the curvature of the Earth, it sometimes exceeds 1/5, and at other times does not amount to 1/15. We have, therefore, made no allowance for refraction in the foregone formula. It will be seen from the above that, in practice, refraction need not be allowed for. It can only exist when the line of sight passes from one medium into another of different density, or where the same medium differs at the point of observation and the point observed. If we allow for the amount of refraction which the ordnance surveyors have adopted, viz., 1/12 of the altitude of the object observed, and apply it to the various experiments made on the Old Bedford Canal, it will make very little difference in the actual results. In the experiment, Figure 3 for instance, where the top of the flag on the boat should have been 11 feet 8 inches below the horizon, deducting 1/12 for refraction, would only reduce it to a few inches less than 10 feet. Others, not being able to deny the fact that the surface of the water in the Old Bedford and other canals is horizontal, have thought that a solution of the difficulty was to be found in supposing the canal to be a kind of trough cut into the surface of the Earth, and have considered that although the Earth is a globe, such a canal or trough might exist on its surface as a chord of the arc terminating at each end. This, however, could only be possible if the Earth were motionless. But the theory which demands rotundity of the Earth also requires rotary motion, and this produces centrifugal force. Therefore the centrifugal action of the revolving Earth would, of necessity, throw the waters of the surface away from the center. This action being equal at equal distances, and being retarded by the attraction of gravitation, which the theory includes, which is also equal at equal distances, the surface of every distinct and entire mass of water must stand equidistant from the Earth's center, and, therefore, must be convex, or an arc of a circle. Equidistant from a center means, in a scientific sense, level. Hence the necessity for using the term horizontal to distinguish between level and straight. Experiment 10. If we stand upon the deck of a ship, or mount to the mast lead, or ascend above the Earth in a balloon and look over the sea, the surface appears as a vast inclined plane, rising up from beneath us, until in the distance it reaches the level of the eye, and intercepts the line of sight. 36. Earth not a globe. Figure 25. If a good plane mirror be held vertically in the opposite direction, the horizon will be reflected as a well-defined mark or line across the center, as represented in Figure 25, h, the sea horizon, which rises and falls with the observer, and is always on a level with his eye. If he takes a position where the water surrounds him as, on the deck or the masthead of a ship out of sight of land, or on the summit of an island far from the mainland, the surface of the sea appears to rise up on all sides equally, and to surround him like the walls of an immense amphitheater. He seems to be in the center of a large concavity, a vast watery basin, the circular edge of which expands or contracts as he takes a higher or lower position. This appearance is so well known to seagoing travelers that nothing more need be said in its support, but the appearance from a balloon is only familiar to a very few observers, and therefore it will be useful to quote the words of some of those who have written upon the subject. The apparent concavity of the Earth as seen from a balloon. A perfectly formed circle encompassed the visibly planisphere beneath, or rather the concavosphere it might now be called, for I had attained a height from which the Earth assumed a regularly hollowed or concave appearance, an optical illusion which increases as you recede from it. At the greatest elevation I attained, which was about 1.5 miles, the appearance of the world around me assumed a shape or form like that which is made by placing two watch glasses together by their edges, the balloon apparently in the central cavity all the time of its flight at that elevation. Wise is aeronautics. Another curious effect of the aerial ascent was that the Earth, when we were at our greatest altitude, positively appeared concave, looking like a huge dark bowl, rather than the convex sphere such as we naturally expect. 37. Earth not a globe s. B. Robotham. To see it, the horizon always appears to be on a level with our eye, and seems to rise as we rise, until at length the elevation of the circular boundary line of the sight becomes so marked that the Earth assumes the anomalous appearance, as we have said, of a concave rather than a convex body. Mayhew's Great World of London. The chief peculiarity of a view from a balloon at a considerable elevation was the altitude of the horizon, which remained practically on a level with the eye, at an elevation of 2 miles, causing the surface of the Earth to appear concave instead of convex, and to recede during the rapid ascent, whilst the horizon and the balloon seemed to be stationary. London Journal, July 18, 1857. Mr. Elliot, an American aeronaut, in a letter giving an account of his ascension from Baltimore, thus speaks of the appearance of the Earth from a balloon. I don't know that I ever hinted heretofore that the aeronaut may well be the most skeptical man about the rotundity of the Earth. Philosophy imposes the truth upon us, but the view of the Earth from the elevation of a balloon is that of an immense terrestrial basin, the deeper part of which is that directly under one's feet. As we ascend, the Earth beneath us seems to recede, actually to sink away, while the horizon gradually and gracefully lifts a diversified slope, stretching away farther and farther to a line that, at the highest elevation, seems to close with the sky. Thus, upon a clear day, the aeronaut feels as if suspended at about an equal distance between the vast blue oceanic concave above and the equally expanded terrestrial basin below. During the important balloon ascents, recently made for scientific purposes by Mr. Coxwell and Mr. Glaisher, of the Royal Observatory, Greenwich, the same phenomenon was observed. The horizon always appeared on a level with the car. See Mr. Glaisher's report, in Leisure Hour, for October 11, 1862. The plane of the Earth offers another delusion to the traveler in air, to whom it appears as a concave surface, and who surveys the line of the horizon as an unbroken circle, rising up, in relation to the hollow of the concave hemisphere, like the rim of a shallow inverted watch glass, to the height of the eye of the observer, how high soever he may be, the blue atmosphere above closing over it like the corresponding hemisphere. Reversed. Glaisher's report, in Leisure Hour, for May 21, 1864. 38. Earth not a globe. The appearance referred to in the several foregoing extracts is represented in the following diagram, Figure 26. Figure 26. The surface of the Earth C.D. appears to rise up to the level of the observer in the car of the balloon, and at the same time, the sky A.B. seems to descend and to meet the Earth at the horizon H. Experiment 11. On the eastern pier at Brighton, Sussex, a large wooden quadrant was fixed on a stand, the upper surface placed square to a plumb line, and directed towards the east, then to the south, and afterwards to the west. On looking over this upper surface, the line of sight in each case seemed to meet the horizon, H, as shown in Figure 27. Figure 27. The altitude of the quadrant was 34 feet, hence, if the Earth is a globe, the water would have curvated downwards from the pier, the horizon would have been more than 7 miles away, and 34 feet below the surface immediately beneath the observer. Which depression, added to the elevation of the quadrant on the pier, would 39. Earth not a globe s. B. Robotham. Give 68 feet as the amount the horizon H would have been below the line of sight. A, B, as shown in the following diagram, Figure 28. Figure 28. To touch the horizon on a convex surface, the line of sight, IC, CB, would have to dip in the direction C, H, as no such dip of the eye line is required. Convexity cannot exist. In the case of the balloon at an altitude of 2 miles, the horizon would have been 127 miles away, and more than 10,000 feet below the summit of the arc of water. Underneath the balloon, and over 20,000 feet below the line of sight A, B, as shown in Figure 29. Figure 29. And the dip C, H, from C, B, to the horizon H, would be so great that the aeronaut could not fail to observe it, instead of which he always sees it on a level with his eye, rising as he rises, and at the highest elevation, seeming to close with the sky. The author has seen and tested this apparent rising of the water and the sea horizon to the level of the eye, and to an eye line at right angles to a plumb line, from many 40 Earth, not a globe. Different places: the high ground near the racecourse, at Brighton, in Sussex, from several hills in the Isle of Wight, various places near Plymouth, looking towards the Eddystone Lighthouse, the Steep Holm, in the Bristol Channel, the Hill of Howth, and Ireland's Eye, near Dublin, various parts of the Isle of Man, Author's Seat, near Edinburgh, the cliffs at Tynemouth, the rocks at Cromer, in Norfolk, from the top of Nelson's Monument, at Great Yarmouth, and from many other elevated positions. But in Ireland, in Scotland, and in several parts of England, he has been challenged by surveyors to make use of the theodolite, or ordinary spirit level, to test this appearance of the horizon. It was affirmed that, through this instrument, when leveled, the horizon always appeared below the crosshair, as shown in Figure 30 C, C, the crosshair, and H, the horizon. Figure 30, Figure 31. In every instance when the experiment was tried, this appearance was found to exist. But it was noticed that different instruments gave different degrees of horizontal depression below the crosshair. The author saw at once that this peculiarity depended upon the construction of the instruments. He ascertained that in those of the very best construction, and of the most perfect adjustment, there existed a certain degree of refraction, or, as it is called technically, collimation, or a slight divergence of the rays of light from the axis of the eye, on P,